December 19th, 1944. A dirt road snakes through the frozen Ardennes forest. Quiet. Lifeless. Snow dampening every sound. The air smells of oil and smoke, the residue of a shattered column nearby. From the haze, a single U.S. Jeep crawls forward. Its canvas top hangs loose, its windshield cracked and dusted with ice. The two men inside wear American helmets, their breath steaming in the cold. The vehicle carries no mounted gun, no escort. To the German Panzer crews positioned along the roadside, engines idling, it looks almost pitiful. An unarmed scout lost in enemy territory. One tank commander lifts his binoculars. He mutters a question to his loader, uncertain. The Jeep is too calm, too deliberate in its advance. Its driver doesn't wave, doesn't surrender. He simply presses on, tires crunching on frozen gravel, nearer and nearer. For a few long seconds, the German crews hold their breath, fingers resting on triggers but not firing. The forest seems to wait with them. Then, a flash of movement from the Jeep's rear seat. Canvas flaps drop, steel barrels rise, and the silence of the Ardennes is torn open by gunfire. The deception had worked. The story of that moment begins months earlier, in a war that had entered its final, reckless stage. By late 1944, the Western Front was a study in exhaustion. The Allies had broken out of Normandy in summer's fury and swept across France with dizzying speed. But as autumn tightened into winter, the war lost its rhythm. Supply lines stretched thin. Fuel was scarce. Men who had fought for months without rest found themselves facing an enemy that refused to die quietly. Germany's armies, crushed yet unbroken, retreated behind the Rhine, only to gather strength one more time. In the heart of the Ardennes, Hitler planned a counterstroke he believed could shatter Allied resolve and perhaps force a negotiated peace. The plan would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. On December 16th, in freezing fog and snow, over 200,000 German troops surged through the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. Their tanks, Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IV, rolled forward under camouflage nets and cloud cover. American units along the thin front lines, many green and poorly positioned, were caught in brutal surprise. Entire divisions were encircled. Command posts fell silent. The German offensive's brilliance lay not only in its speed, but in its secrecy. To deepen Allied confusion, the Wehrmacht deployed an unusual weapon: deception itself. Under Operation Greif, commandos led by Otto Skorzeny donned captured U.S. uniforms, drove seized American vehicles, and spread misinformation among Allied troops. Road signs were twisted, bridges misreported as destroyed, units misdirected. Panic rippled through the ranks as soldiers began suspecting even their own. In this world of distrust, appearances became deadly. Soldiers fired on friendly convoys. Enemy jeeps slipped through checkpoints. The battlefield blurred, and both sides began to exploit that blur. Amid the dense fog of lies and misdirection, another kind of deception took shape. One far smaller, born not of grand strategy, but of survival instinct. American reconnaissance teams, often operating ahead of the main forces, learned quickly that visibility was both danger and opportunity. In the burned-out villages and forest trails of the Ardennes, cleverness could mean life. And it was in this deceptive winter that a simple jeep, outwardly harmless, would become a weapon of cunning. When the German offensive slammed into the Ardennes, U.S. armored divisions scrambled to stabilize the front. In scattered pockets, small units fought desperately to buy time. Improvised blocking forces of tanks, tank destroyers, and reconnaissance platoons. Among those, mechanized cavalry and armored reconnaissance groups became the eyes of the retreating and regrouping Allied armies. Lightly armed, swift, and constantly exposed, they scouted enemy flanks and fed intelligence to divisions straining to hold the line. They drove nimble half-tracks, early armored cars, and, most dangerously, jeeps. The M3A1 Scout cars and Willys MB Jeeps were designed for speed, not armor. Crews improvised constantly. Sandbags on floors, rifles tied to steering columns, machine guns mounted wherever room allowed. Yet these small teams began performing feats far beyond their original design, laying ambushes, raiding command posts, and occasionally taking on tanks in reckless bursts of precision. Deception became part of their craft. In a war defined by overwhelming firepower, subtle tricks could shift the balance. Some crews disguised their jeeps with German markings to get close to enemy columns. Others used canvas covers and fake repair tools to mimic non-combat vehicles, luring overconfident German patrols into close range. Reports from late December 1944 describe numerous small engagements in which jeeps approached armored positions under apparent surrender or neutrality, only to unleash bursts from hidden 30 or 50 caliber machine guns or fire bazookas from beneath tarp covers. It was perilous work. If discovered too soon, they were slaughtered instantly. But if their ruse held, the results could devastate an unsuspecting enemy. Such improvisations grew from the same American field ingenuity. No roaring line of tanks behind them, no overlapping artillery cover, only the hum of a cold engine and the rattle of loose ammunition boxes. Many were barely in their 20s, yet they carried awareness beyond their years. They learned to read terrain like language, to sense when an enemy's silence was suspicion. Sitting meters away from German armor while pretending to be harmless demanded a calmness approaching insanity. One twitch too early, one glance too long at a machine gun mount, and the deception broke, followed by instant death. Deception had always existed in war, but technology magnified its reach. The Jeep's unthreatening silhouette was its camouflage, turning weakness into advantage. A small patrol could approach an enemy position that would annihilate any real attack formation. Surprise was the equalizer. Slipping through enemy lines required precise timing and discipline. The crews drilled in silent coordination, gestures replacing speech. The moment of revelation, when tarps dropped and guns rose, was brutal but brief. The tactic aimed not for prolonged firefights but for paralysis, forcing the enemy to hesitate long enough for supporting fire to engage or for retreat to follow. Though primitive by later standards, these jeeps embodied mechanical adaptability. Their simplicity allowed them to be weaponized through improvisation. Folding brackets for hidden machine guns, collapsible mounts, quick-change ammunition belts, even their sound was a tool. Idling engines mimicked civilian traffic or damaged transports. Engineers back at depots learned from such frontline creativity, later incorporating modular weapons mounts for new vehicles. The Jeep ceased being transport. It became an idea. Stealth on wheels, forged in desperation. That transformation, however, revealed its sharper edge when viewed from the other side of the line. For German tank crews, the winter of 1944 was already a storm of doubt. Radio discipline was strict, communication sporadic, and every sound in the fog carried threat. They had learned to trust their vision. And now that, too, betrayed them. Reports filtered through the ranks of Allied troops using captured vehicles and of jeeps that appeared harmless until they exploded in fire. A moving shape on a forest road, once an easy target, suddenly demanded hesitation. Many Panzer commanders found themselves paralyzed between instinct and uncertainty. Shoot and risk friendly fire, or wait and risk death. The Jeep, the lowliest of Allied vehicles, had infiltrated their psychology. Disguise in warfare was a double-edged sword. Under the Hague Convention, combatants fighting in enemy uniform risked execution if captured. The same blurred ethics surrounded ruse tactics. What defined legitimate deception versus perfidy? For the men in the decoy jeeps, ethics were a luxury. The front demanded action measured in seconds, not in clauses. If deception could save comrades or destroy an ambush, it was used. Some participants later admitted mixed feelings. They admired the trick's brilliance while recoiling from its brutal aftermath. Every deception depended on a moment of human trust. A soldier choosing not to fire, and exploited it ruthlessly. Deception extended far beyond a single jeep. It was ingrained into Allied strategy by 1944, from inflatable tanks across England to fictitious radio chatter before D-Day. What happened in the Ardennes was simply the personal version of the same art. When High Command ordered flexibility, soldiers translated it into field cunning. A jeep masquerading as a courier or engineer trans that defined the late war. Commanders like General George S. Patton encouraged aggressive reconnaissance. Get closer, see more, strike first. His 4th Armored Division and attached cavalry groups learned to attack confusion with more confusion. As the front lines seesawed through the winter of 1944, every unit learned that the simplest tool could carry the deadliest secret. A jeep, stripped of armor, carried only faith in its disguise, and the nerves of the men inside it. From that crucible of cold and chaos rose one of the war's strangest forms of courage, the decoy attack. The frozen roads of the Ardennes became more than a battlefield. They became a theater of illusions. Behind each snowbank and tree line lurked not just firepower, but the art of deception itself. To understand the courage of the jeep crews who gambled everything on disguise, one must see the war from several angles. Inside those canvas-topped jeeps were ordinary men bearing extraordinary nerves. Reconnaissance soldiers often faced isolation unmatched on the front. No roaring line of tanks behind them, no overlapping artillery cover. Only the hum of a cold engine and the rattle of loose ammunition boxes. Many were barely in their 20s, yet they carried awareness beyond their years. They learned to read terrain like language, to sense when an enemy's silence was suspicion. Sitting meters away from German armor while pretending to be harmless demanded a calmness approaching insanity. One twitch too early, one glance too long at a machine gun mount, and the deception broke, followed by instant death. Deception had always existed in war, but technology magnified its reach. The jeep's unthreatening silhouette was its camouflage, turning weakness into advantage. A small patrol could approach an enemy position that would annihilate any real attack formation. Surprise was the equalizer. Slipping through enemy lines required precise timing and discipline. The crews drilled in silent coordination, gestures replacing speech. The moment of revelation, when tarps dropped and guns rose, was brutal but brief. The tactic aimed not for prolonged firefights, but for paralysis, forcing the enemy to hesitate long enough for supporting fire to engage or for retreat to follow. Though primitive by later standards, these jeeps embodied mechanical adaptability. Their simplicity allowed them to be weaponized through improvisation. Folding brackets for hidden machine guns, collapsible mounts, quick-change ammunition belts. Even their sound was a tool. Idling engines mimicked civilian traffic or damaged transports. Engineers back at depots learned from such frontline creativity, later incorporating modular weapons mounts for new vehicles. The jeep ceased being transport. It became an idea, stealth on wheels, forged in desperation. That transformation, however, revealed its sharper edge when viewed from the other side of the line. For German tank crews, the winter of 1944 was already a storm of doubt. Radio. Discipline was strict, communication sporadic, and every sound in the fog carried threat. They had learned to trust their vision, and now that, too, betrayed them. Reports filtered through the ranks of Allied troops using captured vehicles and of jeeps that appeared harmless until they exploded in fire. A moving shape on a forest road, once an easy target, suddenly demanded hesitation. Many Panzer commanders found themselves paralyzed between instinct and uncertainty. shoot and risk friendly fire, or wait and risk death. The Jeep, the lowliest of Allied vehicles, had infiltrated their psychology. Disguise in warfare was a double-edged sword. Under the Hague Convention, combatants fighting in enemy uniform risked execution if captured. The same blurred ethics surrounded ruse tactics. What defined legitimate deception versus perfidy? For the men in the Decoy Jeeps, ethics were a luxury. The front demanded action measured in seconds, not in clauses. If deception could save comrades or destroy an ambush, it was used. Some participants later admitted mixed feelings. They admired the trick's brilliance while recoiling from its brutal aftermath. Every deception depended on a moment of human trust, a soldier choosing not to fire, and exploited it ruthlessly. Deception extended far beyond a single Jeep. It was ingrained into Allied strategy by 1944, from inflatable tanks across England to fictitious radio chatter before D-Day. What happened in the Ardennes was simply the personal version of the same art. When High Command ordered flexibility, soldiers translated it into field cunning. A Jeep masquerading as a courier or engineer transport could gather intelligence or provoke a reaction that revealed German positions. The smallest ruse tightened the noose around the counteroffensive. Each angle, human courage, tactical precision, technological adaptation, moral compromise, and strategic cunning converged on one truth: survival favored imagination. In the winter of 1944, the battlefield rewarded not just strength, but nerve. And nerve was precisely what decided the battle when one Jeep rolled into a column of German tanks. Midday, December 20th, 1944. A pall of mist crawled across the fields west of Bastogne. The sound of engines, heavy, rhythmic, metallic, announced the presence of a German armored spearhead inching along a supply route cut through the forest. Snow lay thick over shattered branches, muffling footsteps and absorbing echo. Down the same road, a single U.S. Jeep emerged from the gloom. Its canvas sides were torn, markings smudged, windscreen fractured by shrapnel. It carried no flag, no convoy, no visible weapon. For the German crews manning their Panzer Fivers and half-tracks, it resembled the sort of abandoned American scout vehicle that occasionally blundered into enemy paths. Through binoculars, Oberfeldwebel Karl Tiedemann, a tank commander of the 2nd Panzer Division, frowned. The Jeep rolled steadily toward them, about 300 meters out, its headlights dim in the fog. His radio hissed with static, but offered no order. "Nicht schießen," he signaled briefly. No one wanted another friendly fire tragedy. Rumors of disguised SS commandos had made even the Germans cautious. The Jeep slowed slightly, weaving as if struggling for traction. Two figures could be seen, driver and passenger. Both slumped low under their helmets. No rifle barrel jutted from the windshield mount. The Panzer infantry lining the route stared, unsure. 200 meters. Then 150. The German tankers waited. The Jeep's engine coughed once, then steadied again. When it reached the lead Panzer's flank, the passenger suddenly straightened. Far too briskly. Canvas at the back tore away. What had seemed like cargo or a radio set was a steel pintle mount. The metallic chatter of a .50 caliber Browning erupted, shattering the frozen air. Armor-piercing rounds hammered across the tank column, ricocheting off glacis plates, glancing through vision ports, striking exposed infantry. The first German gunner reacted half a second too late. The Jeep swung sideways, keeping its narrow profile aligned for escape, all while maintaining fire. Behind its thin armor, every bullet fired was a heartbeat stolen from certain death. Several Panzers returned fire, but confusion spread like wildfire. Orders overlapped, treads ground into slush, Crews scrambled for cover. Smoke began to build from one knocked-out half-track along the verge. The deception had lasted less than a minute, but that minute redefined the engagement. And as the heavy guns turned to retaliate, the final moments of the decoy's run reached their breaking point. As the first bursts from the jeep's hidden, Browning tore across the column, a secondary eruption followed, the unmistakable backblast of a bazooka streaking out from beneath the jeep's rear canvas. The projectile slammed into an approaching half-track loaded with infantry, detonating in a burst of orange fire and twisted metal. Shouts and curses echoed through the fog. The jeep's driver swerved hard left, tires slipping on snow and oil. One hand steady on the wheel, the other fumbling a smoke grenade pin, he hurled the canister toward the nearest ditch. It burst open, filling the clearing with a thick gray shroud. Within seconds, the ambush had transformed the clearing into chaos. German gunners fired blindly, shells ripping through tree trunks and throwing up geysers of snow and earth. But the attackers were already fading, their engine whining low, gear crunching as they retreated back down the woodland track. For Tiedemann's crew, the scene was mayhem. Damage reports filled the airwaves. One half-track immobile, several infantry casualties, the lead Panzer's optics cracked by direct hits. The tank commander's hesitation, that moment of mercy at recognizing familiar shapes, had cost his unit precious seconds. Meanwhile, downstream on the same route, sharpshooters from an American armored reconnaissance troop picked off stragglers drawn out by the commotion. The unarmed jeep had been the bait, its unexpected strike triggering the exact exposure that the Allied ambush required. Artillery coordinates were transmitted within minutes. Shells began to fall across the battered column, sealing its fate. Several vehicles were abandoned. Others reversed hastily into cover, engines smoking, turrets half-rotated. The decoy jeep limped back toward friendly lines with holes stitched across its hull, its tires shredded. One man was wounded, another deafened by the sound of his own gunfire in the confined cabin. Yet their gamble had succeeded entirely. They had provoked fire, revealed the enemy's positions, and survived to tell of it. It was a small engagement by the map's scale, one of hundreds during the Ardennes campaign. Yet it symbolized something larger. In a war increasingly defined by machines, it was still human daring that determined victory or loss. The silence that followed the retreat lingered long after the smoke drifted away. An uneasy calm, marking the end of the deception's deadly illusion. But as the snow settled again over the Ardennes, command staffs on both sides began assessing what such moments truly meant. When word reached headquarters of the small jeep ambush that had stalled a German armored column near Bastogne, it was received not as a feat of heroics, but as a lesson in improvisation. Reports filtered through reconnaissance channels, noting the ingenuity of concealment and the psychological value of the ruse. Commanders recognized that such actions carried weight far beyond their scale. In the brutal arithmetic of December 1944, where divisions were measured by the kilometer gained or lost, the engagement of one disguised jeep scarcely registered. Yet, to the soldiers within the 4th Armored Division and nearby cavalry groups, it became legend. Whispered proof that courage and cunning could offset any imbalance of steel. Captured German prisoners later recounted their confusion. Several believed the Allies had begun widespread use of captured or decoy vehicles. Others insisted that the jeep crews must have been infiltrators in disguise. The rumor itself was valuable. Hesitation cost an army seconds, and seconds on a frozen battlefield could unravel tactics meticulously planned by generals. The 2nd Panzer Division's advance slowed, its commanders ordering tighter verification procedures for all approaching vehicles. That small precaution, multiplied across the front, eroded the offensive's momentum just when rapid action was essential. In that sense, the Battle of Deception achieved far more than destruction. It sowed delay. For the American unit involved, the cost was severe. The jeep was wrecked beyond repair, and its crew rotated to rear areas for rest. both suffering shock and frostbite injuries. They were commended for initiative, but dismissed any notion of heroism. "We only did what the situation asked of us," one survivor later remarked to an army interviewer. Across the snowbound forests, similar ambushes repeated in scattered pockets, each one a reflection of ingenuity born of desperation. Yet, the wider war pressed relentlessly forward, drawing both sides into its final convulsions before Germany's collapse in the spring that followed. The Jeep ambush quickly became one of many small echoes within the growing Allied resurgence across the Ardennes. Patton's Third Army, driving north from Luxembourg, smashed into the southern flank of the German Bulge and began peeling it back layer by layer. Air power returned as the skies cleared after Christmas, and the Luftwaffe's last coordinated gambits faded against the relentless tide of Allied armor and artillery. In this new clarity, the real significance of those early, improvised ruses emerged. Intelligence officers noted how German reconnaissance had begun to falter. Units were wasting vital ammunition on false targets and delaying air or armor support while verifying approaching vehicles. What began as an isolated decoy tactic evolved into a pattern of psychological warfare at the company and battalion level. Proof that fear could be weaponized as effectively as fire. At after-action debriefings, U.S. field commanders urged their reconnaissance teams to document the mechanical tricks that had worked. Removable weapon mounts, smoke-based concealment, position rotation techniques. Those notes filtered into doctrinal adjustments later used during the push into Germany. The principle was simple. Deception was a combat multiplier, especially when resources ran thin. For German units, the effect was demoralizing. Fuel starvation and mechanical failure already crippled mobility. Now the uncertainty of the roads themselves undermined trust. Every silhouette in the fog threatened ambush. Even senior commanders wrote of phantom vehicles haunting their advance, illusions conjured by rumor and panic. The Ardennes offensive bled out by early January 1945. What had begun as Hitler's last gamble ended in attrition and retreat. Frozen soldiers trudged back through shattered forests, their ambitions buried beneath snow that never stopped falling. And within that endless white, the shape of a jeep, small, fragile, almost absurd against the might of tanks, lingered as an emblem of an army that refused to yield even in vulnerability. From this quiet aftermath rose a lasting truth. Cunning remained the final defense when strength was exhausted. The war itself was turning irrevocably toward its end, and the lessons of deception were already etching themselves into the post-war military mind. When the Battle of the Bulge faded into history's cold ledger, much of it was written in numbers. Divisions lost, tanks destroyed, kilometers retaken. Yet between those figures lived the fragments of strangely human stories, such as the jeep that rolled toward German guns pretending to be unarmed. That small act of deception seemed insignificant against the vast machinery of war, but it revealed something timeless about combat and about people forced to survive within it. Ingenuity thrives where fear and necessity meet. The soldiers in that battered jeep did not act from grand strategy. They gambled on illusion because illusion was all they had left. The Second World War had begun with the age of blitzkrieg, sweeping movement, roaring armor, clean lines of doctrine. By its final winter, those certainties had collapsed. What remained was the individual will to adapt. Men on both sides learned that camouflage, silence, and trickery could weigh as heavily as firepower. It was a humbling transformation. Victory no longer belonged solely to machines, but to the imagination guiding them. In later decades, nations studied deception as science. Radar ghosts, inflatable armies, electronic decoys. Yet each evolved from the same impulse that guided that jeep down a snowy road. The decision to make the enemy hesitate, even for one heartbeat. Because in that hesitation lay survival, and sometimes victory itself. When the Ardennes quieted at last, and spring melted the frozen roads, wrecks were dragged aside. Blackened panzers, torn jeeps, hollow remains of the season's fury. Among them, one might still imagine traces of that unlikely ambush. A rusted mount, a canvas scrap, signs of ordinary men who turned illusion into a weapon. Their silence afterward was not pride, but understanding. In war's final, desperate winter, the mind proved its own form of armor. And from that armor came the quiet lesson that endures long after the smoke. Even when stripped of power, resourcefulness remains a soldier's greatest weapon.